Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, both of you, actually. Thank you, Herbert. Thank you, Philip, for inviting me to be a fellow, to be able to be in Berlin, just giving the opportunity to talk to you today about one of my papers that I have recently published that is called The Theory of Artificial Immutability Protecting Algorithmic Groups Under Anti-Discrimination Law. But as Philip has already said, I do usually work with a bunch of people, and I wanted to just give an opportunity to talk about them very quickly. So as I said, I'm Sandra Wachter, I'm a lawyer by background, but I do have an amazing team that I work with at Oxford, which is the group of my research group, the Governance for Emerging Technologies. Those are the folks that I'm working with. Brendan Listett was on the picture here. I don't think he's in the room yet. He might be coming later. We co-founded that group a couple of years back together with Chris Russell. And as you can see, over the years, we have been very successful in bringing really, really interesting people on board. We just finished another round of recruitment, so the group will be getting bigger very soon. And so, as you can see, it's from background very, very different. We have people from law, we have people from ethics, from computer science, from psychology, political science, and so we're really, really interested to look at governance from a holistic perspective from different types of areas. So if you're interested in the work that we're doing at Oxford, then I encourage you to have a look at the project that we're currently leading. But basically what we're trying to do is to figure out what kind of new risks emerging technologies pose, whether the law has any answers to it yet, and if the law doesn't have any answers, what it is that the law should be doing, and this is when ethics comes in. And then lastly, we think about whether there could be a tech solution in order to fix some of the problems. So that's like one of the methodologies that we very often use. They're very, very broad in scope, but explainability, data protection, and bias and discrimination have been topics very closely at the forefront of my research in gender, and the paper today that I'm going to be talking about will exactly do that. And so I just want to give you a quick overview of what I want to discuss. As I said, the paper is quite lengthy, so I cannot talk about everything there, but I hopefully give you a nice overview over. So yes, this is just a quick overview of the talk today. So I think everybody in this room will be aware that AI is here to stay. AI is being used to make very important decisions about people. You know, AI is used to decide if you should get a loan, if you get insurance, if you're going to get admitted to university, if you have to go to prison. Life-changing decisions. I think everybody in this room will also be very aware that we know that AI causes harm to a lot of people. Very often those communities are people that have been stigmatized in the past and are seen as, some type of vulnerability protected group. So very often people get discriminated based on gender, ethnicity, ability, sexual orientation. That is not something that is really new, unfortunately. The thing that is quite new, and that's what the focus of the talk is about, is that AI might group you in a different way, not in a traditional way of how we would think about gender, ethnicity, but maybe it starts grouping you according to how you move your eye, how you move your mouse, how fast the rate of your heart is going, and uses this grouping to make the same types of decisions about you. So maybe decide if you should get a loan, or if you have to go to prison, and things like that. So the first part of the talk will just give an introduction of how new types of groups are being created by AI, and then being used as a foundation for decision making, and how that's very different to how humans make decisions about people. And then we're going to talk about whether those new types of groups actually do find protection under non-discrimination law, so the law that wants to protect certain harms from happening, for example, discrimination based on gender. And in order to answer that question, we actually need to think about very philosophically about the question of what makes a group worthy of protection. When and if does society believe that certain groups should be protected over others? I will show you that I'm of the opinion that those new groups do not find any protection currently under the law, and I will justify that claim as we go along. But I will end by telling you how I think the law needs to change to extend protection to those new groups. So this is the overview, and I'm going to go over everything in more detail. But let us start with just the basic question of like AI and fairness and why we really need to think about that. Again, we all need to care about bias because the technology in the way that it's built demands that. So when you deploy AI to make decisions about people, that be hiring or if somebody should be admitted to university, the way that you do that is that you use historical data, you train an algorithm, tell the algorithm what do all those people have in common, come up with a profile, and tell me what the ideal candidate would be. So that means if I'm hiring, a chair professor at Oxford, I want to hire a chair professor there, and I want to use an algorithm to do so. What I will be doing is I'm going to feed the algorithm with historical data of people who have held chair professorships in the past at Oxford. So I'm going to feed into the algorithm the information that I have from the last 100 years, for example. I'm going to feed in their reference letters, their purpose statements, the grades that they had, their CVs, and I tell the algorithm, of all those resumes, what have they in common? What is the recurring pattern there? Try to find me the ideal candidate based on that, because we had those amazing people, right? So the algorithm comes up with that profile, and then a new person will apply for that job. And the algorithm will compare, does this new applicant look like a person who has previously worked at Oxford and has held professorships there? So, as we will be knowing that most professorships that have been given out over the last 60, 80 years, people who have gotten them, that's not a very diverse group of people. So, a person like me would actually not get the job, probably, if an algorithm was making that decision. So you can see that every time we make decisions, the patterns, the decision patterns that we leave behind will pick up the unfairness again and transport it into the future. It's not just in hiring. For every type of decision, you have to ask yourself the question, do you think that we have found a good way of making good decisions? And usually the answer is no. And so this is how it works from a tech perspective, right? And this is where we always have to care about bias. And it's not just an academic problem, it's unfortunately real reality. So just 3 examples to show that. This is from my home country, very troubling example from 2019, where the Austrian Employment Agency rolled out an algorithm to help assign or allocate resources and benefits for people who have lost their jobs. And so the algorithm that was deployed there was heavily discriminatory towards women, people living with disabilities, and older people. Again, the whole bias of the job market was fed into the algorithm and spat out. So you could see that the unfairness found its way into an algorithmic system. In my adopted home, the UK, something similar happened. This was in 2020 during the pandemic. What happened is that the final exams that students need to take before they can go to university, the A-levels, couldn't be held because of the COVID pandemic. So what the government did instead is they created an algorithm that calculated the test score that they think the student would have had they been able to sit through the course, sit through the exam, right? What did happen is that it heavily favored students from private universities and heavily discriminated against students of color or students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Why did that happen? Because the UK class and educational system is just the underlying basis of that algorithm and therefore is forwarding that divide. And the last example that I have here is algorithms that discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation and also their ethnicity. So we know that content moderation tools that are being used to flag unsuitable content are heavily biased towards the LGBTQ community. So whenever you have a content moderation algorithm that is supposed to detect whether something is toxic, it will assume that something that is said by a gay person is more toxic than a straight person. So again, our assumptions of what is toxic are human assumptions feeding into the algorithm, discriminating against those groups. But of course, this type of discrimination is new, unfortunately. We always have had sexism, racism, ableism, heterosexism, and we have laws for that. But what if I told you that algorithms do group you in a very different way, in a way that the law did not anticipate at all? What if I told you that an algorithm might be able to detect or infer that you're a dog owner? That's my dog, by the way. And uses that information to tailor certain content to you, offer you certain goods and services because they assume that you're a dog owner. What if an algorithm classifies you or groups you as a sad teenager, which is something that Twitter can do, and they show you certain content based on that? An algorithm might also be able to infer that you're a gambler, or a single parent, or a person living in abject poverty, right? All of those things are not legally protected in that sense. Also, an algorithm might be able to infer that you're a video gamer. And you could rightfully say, well, who cares? What is the worst thing that could happen if you classify as a video gamer? Well, if you look, for example, what's happening in China, that is actually something that could be very worrisome for you. As you might be aware that China is rolling out the social credit system, or has been rolling out the social credit system, which means that there are algorithmic systems that collect data from public and private sources to calculate whether or not you're a good citizen. So a good citizen means good things for you if you are a good citizen. It means that you get better offers in supermarkets, but if you're a bad citizen, it might mean that you're no longer allowed to leave the country or not allowed to go to certain schools anymore. So if in China, if an algorithm believes that you're a video gamer, that's something that makes your social score drop. So we actually have or worse life than you had before. So in that sense, video gaming could have a negative discriminatory effect. But we don't have to look to China to see how new groups form the basis for decision making. We know, for example, if you're shopping online, that if you're an Apple user, you will have to pay higher prices than a PC user. If you're applying for insurance in the Netherlands, you might not be aware that the address that you have has an impact on what your premium will be. So if you apply for insurance and the address has a number and a letter in the address, you pay a higher fee. If you only have a number, you pay a lower fee. Or, that's my personal advice for you, if you're applying for a job online, I would recommend that you use a browser such as Chrome or Firefox. Do not use a browser like Safari or Internet Explorer. If you do that, you're more likely to get rejected from the job application. So and that's still an understanding, okay, something to do with browser history has an impact, but it gets even more obscure than that, where I don't even know how to describe that in language anymore. So for example, if you're applying for an online loan, the way how you move your mouse, how fast you scroll, and whether you use capital letters or not, has an impact on whether you get the job or not. Or facial recognition software that is being widely used, for example, in recruiting or for interviews, where software is measuring how fast your retina is moving, how much sweat you have on your forehead, how often you blink, the pitch of your voice. All of that is being used to decide whether you should get a job. Same is happening with credit, for example. Facial recognition software is being used to decide if you should get a loan. We also see a rollout in educational system, very, very popular, is eye-tracking software. Eye-tracking software that is used to see how a child's eye is moving to make a decision on where to place them. Should this be advanced classes, not advanced classes? Should they be put forward for special education, ADHD testing? Or in general, students and pupils are constantly being surveilled, how they move their eyes, how they move their head, how they move their mouse. How often do you watch around in the room? Do they look to the left more often or to the right? And all of that gives a signal on whether there is suspicious behavior, in a sense, which feeds that back. And the last one that I have here is emotional detection, right? Where your facial cues, how your muscles are moving, how your eyes are moving, gives allegedly an indication of what your emotional state is. And that is being widely used. This is used for decision-making in hiring. This is being used at borders for immigration purposes, it's being used for diagnosis of patient, and it's being used to monitor how well group meetings are going in the workplace. So all of that is happening. It's measuring the oddest thing to make very important decisions about you. So we end up in a situation where you have those two new groups that are kind of emerging that don't really fit with our common understanding of decision making. We have those non-protected groups, which is, for example, the dog owners or the Internet Explorer users or gamers, where we have like a social understanding of what that means. And then we have completely incomprehensible groups where I don't even know what that would mean. The way how you move your mouse, the speed at which your retina is moving, electronic signals, the pixels in the picture, incomprehensible, I don't even know what that means. But looking at non-discrimination law, the groups that you should not take into consideration when making important decisions, those are based on birth, age, disability, race, sex, gender, social origin, right? That makes a lot of sense. But if all of a sudden new types of groups are being used to make decision making, should we at least have a discussion on whether we should grant some type of protection here? And this was the starting point of my journey here. Why is it a theory paper? It is a theory paper because theory was really necessary at this point. Because I started to look at first at the case law, right? I wanted to ask the question, have people ever tried to go to court to fight for new groups to be protected under non-discrimination law? Surely that must have happened. Yes, it has happened. There are at least 3 cases where somebody wanted to go to court and say, I think my particular grouping should also have protection in the law. All 3 have failed. The first one had to do with somebody who got fired because they were obese. And they wanted to make the claim that obesity should be a protected attribute under the law. The court said, no, that's not possible. The second one had to do with chicaneras, which was a case where somebody tried to say that they think that chronic sickness should be a protected attribute under the law. They were making the argument that it should either be its own right, a new group that should have protection, or that it should be protected under the realm of disability, because disability is a protected attribute. Neither of that was allowed, according to the court. The court said, no, it is not disability, protection is not allowed, you cannot extend it, and new rights are not possible to create. The last one, in my opinion, is the most damning one for a bunch of reasons. This is the case of Paris. It's a case from the UK where a same-sex couple, or the survivor of a same-sex couple, was wanting to get a survivor's pension. So the partner has died and they were trying to get the survivor's pension, which is something that the law did allow if the same-sex couple entered into a civil partnership before the age of 60. So if you did that, then you were entitled to survivor's pension. In this case, at the time where Mr. Paris and the same-sex partner were 60 years old, it wasn't legal to get married yet. So he came and said, that's discriminatory. It's discriminatory based on sexual orientation as well as age, because they have been living together for more than 10 years at that point. He lost. He lost because the court said intersectional discrimination is not a thing. You cannot try to say that something is a problem based on 2 protected attributes at the same time. You gotta find your protected attribute and say that's the reason for discrimination. You cannot say that it's age as well as sexual orientation. And I don't have to tell anybody how damning that is for anybody who knows how the sexual discrimination actually works. How problematic that is to assume discrimination is only one-sided. But unfortunately, the court has been really, really restrictive in allowing new groups to be added or even allowing new identifications of a protected group to be expanded. So, in my opinion, it was time for theory, right? If the end of the spectrum is when the law makes its decision in court, then at the forefront, at some point, there's theory. And so I needed to think about what makes a group worthy of protection. So at what point, why did we decide that ethnicity or gender are worthy of protection and other groups are not? And if I can make the argument that the usage of groupings such as how you move your retina, how fast your heart is beating, whether or not you are moving your mouse in a certain way. If the usage of those grouping causes similar harm, then you can make an argument that they also should be protected. But it comes down to what makes a group worthy of protection. I was really, really naive when I started that project because I thought I'm just going to open up like one book and I'm going to find the definition of what makes a group worthy of protection. This will be an easy paper. Nothing's further from the truth. I don't know. I think you can fill 700 libraries with interesting theories and interesting contributions from amazing people who have been discussing for God knows how long what makes a group worthy of protection. There is no such thing, no checklist that tells you, and this is why we think that certain groups should have any protection. So one of the contributions is actually to come up with a taxonomy myself, based on what I have found there. So you can agree or disagree with that, but this is some framework that I started to work with, where I try to make sense when and if a group should be protected under the law, under the current doctrine, right? The current doctrine of non-discrimination law. And so those are the four things that always come up when we think about when a group should be protected under the law. Long story short, I don't think that those new groups fit anywhere in there at all. But I'm going to walk through you and tell you why they don't, and then I'm going to tell you why I think it's a problem. So the first one has to do with immutability and choice. So the law usually thinks that you should not be judged on something that you have no control over. So if you have an immutable characteristic, so something that you're not able to change, then it should not be the basis for decision making. For example, when you're getting a job. So traditional immutable characteristics are something like ability or age. You cannot change that, and therefore it should not be something that should form the basis of decision making. At the same time, there are certain choices that the law wants to protect. For example, religion, right? I can choose and change my religion as I please, but it would be really unreasonable to go to a job interview and they would ask me to change my religion based on that. So in a way, the law protects immutable characteristics and fundamental choices. The issue is that algorithmic groups are neither of that. They kind of fall in the middle. So think the usage of your browser, how you move your mouse, how fast you scroll, whether you're a video gamer, whether you have a dog. That's not immutable. And it's probably also not a fundamental choice in the same way that religion would be. So it would actually fall in the middle, and according to that, it would not be a problem to use them because they're not deserving of protection. The second that very often comes up has to do with relevance, arbitrariness, and merit. So it makes a lot of sense that we would say, don't use gender or race to make important decisions because it has nothing to do with the task at hand. Saying that women or people of color are less good at certain tasks is not legal because it has nothing to do with the competency of a person, like gender or ethnicity has nothing to do with it. It's completely irrelevant. Therefore, you cannot use sex to say, you're not going to get the job. This makes sense in a human setting where we understand the prejudices of people, but with AI, it's a little bit different because AI makes everything relevant. In fact, that's the whole point of AI, is trying to find connections and correlations between data points where nobody ever thought to think. So algorithms might find a correlation between high heart rates and being able to repair a loan, liking the color green and being a good worker, right? Everything can be relevant. So if we allow that relevance criterion to sanction the use of algorithmic groups, it's a free-for-all and you can use basically everything. So again, no hindrance to use any of the algorithmic groups. The third one, again, will come as no surprise, has to do with historical oppression, stigma, and structural disadvantage. Again, think traditional protected groups, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, social status. Why are they protected? Well, because they have a long-lasting, still ongoing oppression that they have to endure. Right? Very often they are discriminated in a lot of aspects of their life, ranging from education to employment, housing, and things like that. That makes a lot of sense. With AI, that doesn't really work either, like the video gamers, the Internet Explorer users, people who move their retina in a certain way, those are not people who face discrimination the same way that black people would, right? In fact, it's also hard to say that stigma actually exists because very often you don't even know that you're part of a group, or society doesn't know that you're part of a group. So how can oppression even be performed, if you will, if nobody knows that you're part of a certain group? And you could say, well, new stigma and new types of oppression could actually arise, but it's really, really hard to point to that, especially with algorithmic groups. Why? Well, because those groups are ephemeral. Right? They don't exist forever. They're not static. They're constantly changing. Your behavior is also constantly changing. So you're moving from one group to the other. One day you didn't get the job because of your dog. The next day because your retina was moving in an odd way. And the day after because you had a great car. So it's really, really hard to actually say, can you see there's a new type of oppression that is emerging because it's constantly changing. So again, structural disadvantage doesn't really work here. The last one has to do with social saliency. So the law doesn't want to protect random groups. The law only wants to protect homogeneous groups. And that means that the group has to have some meaning for the people involved and or society at large. So typical attributes that signify saliency are things like having a common culture, shared identity, history, tradition. All of that gives indication that there is social saliency in groupings. With algorithmic groups, that's not really the case, right? How you choose your browser, how fast you type, if you use capital letters or not, that's not a shared community. Who are your brethren in that sense? Like, there is not enough shared identity. In fact, I would argue it's really hard to even have a shared identity because there's not even social language or human language to describe what that group looks like, right? How a pixel is changing, how much time you spend on advertisement, whether you are using capital letters or not. Like, what is that group? I don't know how to describe that. So how would that group even have a shared identity or community? So according to all of that, those known groups have no protection whatsoever, and you can just use them as you please because they are not worthy of protection. So I wasn't really happy with that outcome. So I thought, well, maybe I have to add another layer of abstraction and thinking about theory. Because we thought first, okay, what makes a group worthy of protection? Then I started thinking, okay, but why those groups? Why protecting those groups? Why is discrimination wrong to begin with, right? Why is discrimination wrong? And again, I thought that must be a very easy thing to answer, but it isn't. It is really not. It took me months and months to figure out why discrimination is actually wrong. But the aim was to say, if I can make the point that the wrongness of discrimination is comparable to when I'm using heart rate for decision making, that it would be for using ethnicity, then I can make the argument that we should open up the wrongness protection. Long story short, I do not think that algorithmic groups invoke the same moral wrongness that discrimination would. Why? So if you look at what people believe makes discrimination wrong, they will say things like, people think of other people of inferior worth. They want to demean a person. They want to treat them with disrespect or stigmatize them, subordinate them. They have an image of a person that is not capable, that is beneath them. When you think of algorithmic groups, that's not necessarily the case. You think of coders looking at a data set, they don't really have that feeling. They don't even know who's in the data set. They have no attachment to what's going on there. They don't know what's in there. They don't know what they're dealing with, right? How could they sympathize or not sympathize with people that are ranked based on their spending habits, how much time they spend on the web page, how they move their mouse. They are optimizing a process. There is no idea of this person spends 0.3 seconds longer on a web page, therefore I think lesser of them. That doesn't exist in the same way, right? And so using them to make decisions isn't problematic in the same way because they're not considering those people of less than inferior worth. It's like, okay, well, fine. That didn't work. I'm going to give it a last shot to think about another layer of abstraction that I could put on top of that to figure out whether we should open up that spot. And the last attempt that I did was to think about the aim of non-discrimination law. Like, what is the aim of the law? What is it that the law wants to achieve? What would society look like if law got its way? And if the usage of groups, like how you move your retina and how fast your heart is beating, is standing in the way of that aim, then you can make the argument that those groups should be protected as well. Unfortunately, I don't think that they're standing in the same way in like other protected groups. Why? Because the aim of non-discrimination law in Europe, I have to say, is about social equity. It's about substantive equality. It's about trying to eradicate the past lingering effects of discrimination. It's ending oppression, it's ending domination, it's trying to combat subordination and stigmatization. So what that means is that the law rightfully assumes there are people who are able to oppress other people, and the law wants to close that gap. That's the aim of the law, right? With those groups, that distinction doesn't really work because there's not one algorithmic group that is always winning out. There isn't the dog owners that are always losing out, or the internet explorers that are always losing out, or the people with the weird moving retinas. No, those groups are ephemeral. You change them, they change them, you move from one group to the other. They're completely random, they're nonsensical. And because there's a group, this gap doesn't exist, the law doesn't need to step in. Right? It's the randomness that is the harm, not the picking on one particular group. So I was at my wit's end and I decided, well, I guess non-discrimination law is not there to help in that way. But I really thought that that's a problem because I still think there is a problem. Just coming back to those two groups that I have identified that are being used to make important decisions, those non-protected groups, those video gamers, internet explorers, and those completely non-comprehensible groups, again, heartbeat, facial movement, pixels, the signals that you send off whenever you open your laptop, they have an impact on your life. They make decisions on whether you're going to get a job. They have an impact on whether or not you're going to get the loan. You face is the arbitrator of whether to get your job. And your students are going to be ranked based on how they move their eyes. And your emotions are going to open and close doors for you without you having any control over it. So there is a problem, in my opinion. It's just not a problem that the law did anticipate. And so I thought, well, maybe it's time to think about a new type of theory. Maybe we have to think about harm differently. And this is where my personal contribution comes in, or my idea is to think about a new theory of harm, the harm of artificial immutability or artificially created immutability. That's a new type of harm that I want to investigate. And so what I try to base this theory on is to say that I think at the very basis of non-discrimination law, the law wants you to be successful with your life plans. The law wants you to have certain liberties and freedoms and access to goods and services. The law wants you to receive an education and to train for a profession, to have housing, to have food, to have all of that, right? And so that's the basic thing that the law wants to do, and it's stepping in if something is standing in the way. Well, something is standing in the way. It's just a different thing that the law did anticipate, right? The law did anticipate that somebody who has bigoted views about gender identity, ethnicity, sex, sexual orientation, will withhold resources like education or jobs or housing because they think of you of lesser moral worth. So they think that you don't deserve them. They will act as a gatekeeper. Algorithms don't necessarily have that image, and yet they're holding you back from having access to those same resources. They're not holding you back based on your gender, but they're holding you back by assigning you to a random group. that you don't understand, like how your eye is moving, an ephemeral group that is constantly changing, an unsensible group where you don't even have any understanding of who is part in the group and how to get out of it. Something that you have no understanding, have no way to contest, have no way to control. And if you don't have any way to control it, then it is immutable to you because you can no longer change it. Therefore, immutable. So the harm is the same. Somebody is using an arbitrary criterion that you have no control over to withhold resources, but just the mode, the perpetrator, and the process of bringing about that harm is different. And so in my opinion, this allows for a rethinking of harm in the algorithmic age. And I wanted to tease out a little bit more what I mean by artificially created immutability and that type of harm. And again, this is one of my first thinking about that. What do I mean by artificial immutability? And I came up with 5 different instances where I think that artificially created immutability is produced. So again, I use the word immutability in relation to other things that you cannot change, like your DNA, for example, but it is just artificially created. And so the first one has to do with opacity. So if I don't know what kind of criteria you're using to admit people to law school, I have no control over it. I cannot control it. What is uncontrollable to me is immutable to me. So even if I use dog ownership to decide if somebody should get into Oxford, if I don't know about it, then I cannot buy a dog. So I have no control to actually participate in that decision-making process. Second one has to do with vagueness. I can give you some indication of what it is that I'm basing my decision on. For example, I could say, and this is happening, that your friends on Facebook, if you do, have an impact on whether or not you get the loan. So, depending on whether you have good friends or bad friends, credit decisions will be based on that. I can tell you that, but does that mean you know what are the good friends and the bad friends? What kind of friends are the ones that you should get rid of if you want to get the loan? You don't know because it's too vague. If it's too vague, you have no control. It is immutable to you. Instability, I already talked about that in somewhat more detail. None of those groups are stable. They're constantly changing. The models are constantly changing. You are contributing to the changing. Think, for example, cell phone usage, how often you visit an app. That fluctuates. And every time you change your behavior, you're being grouped somewhere else. So you are constantly moving from one group to the other, as well as the grouping updates, because at some point the algorithm thinks app usage is no longer interesting, dog ownership is more important. So how would you prepare if you wanted to go to university? How would you brush up your CV if the criteria are constantly changing in that way? Involuntariness, that's a big one, especially when it comes to facial recognition software. If I'm measuring the sweat on your forehead, if I'm looking how your retina is moving, if I'm measuring your heartbeat, that is something that you have no control over, right? So it is immutable to you. And the lack of a social concept. The clicking patterns, the electronic signals that you're sending, how fast you type in, name that thing. I have no word for it. We don't have a word for it. So if I cannot describe to you what it is that I'm measuring, then you have no control to change it. So those are some of the artificially created immutability attributes that I think are problematic. And I think that they actually do contribute to disrupting or eliminating good decision criteria. And good decision criteria, again, are at the heart of non-discrimination law. I don't think many people know that, but one of the reasons why we push so much for transparency when it comes to loans or employment decisions or how we admit people to university is because the civil rights movement was pushing for that. Civil rights movement was really, really active in making clear what kind of criteria are being used to rein in nepotism, to rein in sexism, to rein in racism, to create an equal playing field for that. So transparency is really, really important in that regard. And so good decision criteria, in my opinion, are those that I've listed here. Unfortunately, yet again, the immutability aspect of those new groups is disrupting and destroying them
Like transparency is really, really important, but AI is not used to make anything transparent. It's the opposite. Like you give a bunch of data into an algorithm and tell them who would be the best person to hire. It's not coming up with good decision criteria. It's just saying this person or that person. In fact, nobody cares about the rules of decision making. Nobody cares about that. Very often you can't even explain what kind of criteria are being used. So the idea that transparency can be upheld is very, really problematic because that's not what it's being used for. Again, stability already said, because those systems are constantly changing, how would you be able to prepare? Now, if your kids are going to prepare their university applications, you will tell them, have good grades, be nice to your teachers and get some reference letters, don't have any typos in your application. Those are evergreens, everybody knows that. But if they're constantly changing, and as they go, next year's because you have a poodle, the year after because your retina is moving in a certain way, then it's your heartbeat, then it's your diet, then it's how you type and what you use capital letters. What advice are you going to give to your children to put forward a good application to get into university? If it's not stable, it's not possible. Similar with empirical coherence. Fairness in decision making also has to do with whether or not we believe that the criteria at hand that we're using to make decision has something to do with the decision at hand. Grades, for example. We say you should have good grades because that's an indication that you're good at something. Having good grades will land you a good job, it will land you a good spot in the university. That is socially accepted. There is even empirical coherence to say that grades are a good indicator of how well somebody will be doing. Nobody cares about that with AI. Like Jonathan Citrin called it the death of theory for that reason. Nobody cares anymore what the social story is between the data points. What that means is that you are seeing an interesting correlation. A person who likes the color green and is also going to be good at the job, that's done. Nobody cares anymore. The algorithm has said that that's enough, but nobody cares whether liking the color green is actually a good indicator for being creative, being a good worker, being able to repair a loan. None of that is there. And that all of that makes it problematic from a normative acceptable standpoint. And so again, I think the usage of this group is disrupting our standards for good decision making. So what's the solution? So whenever I say or talk about this, people say, well, you know, easy, just more transparency, fine. Just make everything transparent, open up the black box, and it's all gonna be okay. And to that I say, yes, transparency is meaningful and transparency is important, but it's only a partial remedy. Like I can tell you that the speed at which your retina moves has an impact on whether you get the loan. This will not give you the ability to make your retina move slower. So it's not just about transparency, it's about power. It's about control. It's about autonomy. It's about, do you have an active role in that process? Have you any ability to change the criteria that are being used to make decisions? So whenever I say that, people come back and say, are all types of mutable characteristics problematic? No, of course not. Of course not. In the same way that not all usage of traditional immutable characteristics are problematic. For example, age is an immutable characteristic. I cannot change my age, unfortunately. That'd be great. But even though it's an immutable characteristic, we have laws against child labor, which is a good thing, I would argue. So we have allowed that the legislator uses a protected attribute to make decisions, age. And the same type of assessment needs to happen with artificially created immutability characteristics. So what that means is that if you're using eye movement, retina movement, how fast your heart is beating, how you move your mouse, whether you use capitals or not, how fast you scroll, that is fine, but you would need to justify it in the same way that you would need to justify that it's okay to use age when making certain decisions, or how we have had this with so many other immutable characteristics. Intelligence is not something that you can change, but we have schools that say you can only get in there if you have a certain IQ. We have accepted that. There are height requirements for basketball. This is something I cannot change either. I wouldn't make the team, and we are all okay with that, including myself. And eyesight, pilot licenses. We are okay to say that you have to have 20/20 eyesight, even though that's not something you can change. It's not a problem to use those characteristics if you can justify it. What I'm saying is that when it is artificially created, if it's artificially immutable, then it is on the face problematic. You just need to justify it in the same way that it is on the face problematic to use something like height that you cannot change in the same way. So that's what I'm proposing. I'm proposing more engagement with those types of questions. Why is it important? I think it's really, 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 really important because I think we're barking up the wrong tree completely at the moment. There is a lot of attention on trying to expand, to use non-discrimination law to solve the bias problem. But the issue is that discrimination just occurs very often in a different way that the law has not anticipated. So the law is very much concerned with don't use gender, don't use race, don't use ethnicity. Companies are not doing that because it's illegal. So they are really, really shying away from using directly protected evidence. They're really, really cautious with that. So it doesn't really happen. What happens much more is that they're using proxies. They're using, your shopping history, the hair products that you use where you go to shop to have an image about ethnicity and your gender. But that's really hard to prove for the outside person. Like, I'm not just looking at your driving patterns. Does that correlate with ethnicity? Maybe, maybe not. That's super hard to prove, right? So you have this group that doesn't link to a protected attribute and therefore doesn't find any protection. So we think we're doing the right thing, but the group is so diverse and so far detached from a traditional attribute that it doesn't find any protection. Also, there are techniques where you can just diversify a group to make it look more harmless, yet it is still a problem. Very often, actually, especially in the advertising space, those new groups are really popular because advertisers want to advertise to dog owners and video gamers and single parents and to winter sport enthusiasts, all of which don't have any protection, but the whole advertisement industry is based on that, finding those types of people, not necessarily linked to gender or ethnicity. And AI is creating those non-comprehensible groups where nobody actually makes those mid-level inferences to figure out how it correlates to anything, right? It's about you opening up your laptop and the signals that you're sending there. This is how fast you type. Do you use capital letters? How much sweat is on your forehead? Do you use your mouse to the left or to the right first? It's measuring all of that. I don't have a word for that, but that's happening. That's where the bulk of data collection happens. That's the bulk of the data that is being used for decision making, and yet the law doesn't really protect it, because how could it? Because 200 years ago nobody thought about that. So it's not a criticism of the law or technology, it's just an unfortunate marriage in that sense. So my proposal is not to do just add groups to the list. That's not what I'm proposing, because that's what people say, what are you going to do? Do you want to protect everybody, Internet Explorer users and dog owners and video gamers? No. I'm not saying just put any type of group on there. Actually, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying let's move away from a material definition of group. I don't care who is in that group. I only care how the group is being created. So what that means is I want to move away from a material definition and move on to a formal definition of a group. So I do care about how the group is being established. Is it a random group? Is it an ephemeral group? Is it an ostensible group that you have no understanding that you're part of? No understanding in human language to understand what's going on there. No way of contesting your membership or having any control over it. If that is the case, then in my head, it is artificial, immutable, and therefore on the face problematic. So I don't care who is in that group. I only care how the group is being created. And if it's random, ephemeral, nonsensical, then in my opinion, we have a problem. So how would that work in practice? I actually think it would fit very nicely with how how we have grappled with those issues in the past. The first question is to ask, is the criterion that I'm using de facto immutable? Is it artificially immutable? Has an algorithm attached it to you, like web traffic, eye tracking, emotion detection, right? Or is it based on a choice? And if it is immutable, then you have to make a stance, or you have to make a justification on why it's acceptable to use. In the same way that we have to justify intelligence, high intelligence for university admissions, we will have to have a justification for immutable characteristics that you cannot change. So the paper is not there to tell you eye tracking is bad and web traffic is bad and emotion is bad, but it's okay to use video game as a dog or else. That's not what the paper is doing. The paper is actually just a detection tool or a framework to start thinking about the acceptability of all of that. It's really about trying to think whether or not it's acceptable to use that and whether there's any grounding that that's a good metric for decision making. Has anybody actually thought about whether eye tracking is good to decide on student placements in that sense? So this is really not telling people what to do, but inviting people to think differently about harm. And if we did that, then I think we would, in fact, really realize the actual idea of what the law really wants, right? Because the law really wants to equal the playing field. The law wants fair competition, and the law wants you to win. Thank you very much.